In Hollywood, there are names people don't avoid because they're unimportant, but because they're so important that everyone chooses silence. Today, Burt Reynolds will finally reveal the things he has kept hidden for nearly half his life. Things connected to Clint Walker, the cleanest, most straightforward man in Hollywood, someone who seemed incapable of being touched by any shadow. Yet Clint is the one who carried secrets Burt never dared to speak publicly. What are those revelations? Are they the truth behind the quiet, unspoken bond between two icons of the same era? Are they what Burt witnessed inside Warner Brothers things that forced him into silence for decades? Or are they the untold details of the 1971 accident when a metal rod pierced Clint's chest at an angle so bizarre that Hollywood chose to simply ignore it? Burt Reynolds has finally spoken. And what he revealed may force us to see Clint Walker in a completely different light. Let us uncover the truths Hollywood never wanted to hear again. 1. Not every actor survives when a metal rod nearly a meter long pierces straight through their chest. But Clint Walker did, and that alone is what frightened Hollywood. That was the sentence Burt Reynolds finally let slip after over 40 years of silence. A short, slightly raspy sentence, but powerful enough to make anyone who knew Clint Walker's story feel a chill Burt had finally spoken. Not in his usual tell-it-all manner, but with a half-confession, half-reminder of something Hollywood had tried to forget long ago. In 1971, in the cold mist of Mammoth Mountain, California, Clint Walker was searching for a bit of peace away from the world that had built him, yet confined him for years. Clint always preferred mountains to parties the forest wind over applause. But right there at the peak where everything seemed calm, a strange accident struck, an accident that Burt Reynolds later said was something Hollywood didn't want to talk about, because the more you mention it, the more wrong it feels. According to the Reno Gazette in May 1971, Clint was sliding down a small slope when a metal rod nearly a meter long suddenly shot upward from beneath the snow. Witnesses said it appeared in a way that didn't follow any physical logic. It didn't just pop up, it shot upward at the exact angle, the exact speed, in a trajectory so precise it was frightening. In an instant, the rod tore through his thick jacket, through his ribs, through his chest, and stopped just millimeters from his heart. Ski guide Paul R. Stoddard, who stood only a few feet away, recalled in an interview with Sierra Sun. It happened too fast. No one could understand it. If you call it an accident, then yes. But it was such a strange accident that I don't even know where to begin describing it. When Burt Reynolds later heard those words again, he only sighed. I remember seeing something off. At the hospital, surgeon George Fromm, the man who saved Clint's life, said the sentence that left everyone speechless. Just a few millimeters off, and he would have been gone instantly. A man surviving on odds close to zero. And when something that close to impossible happens, Hollywood starts whispering. Midnight Globe and Hollywood Star News ran sensational headlines. Was someone trying to get rid of him? A warning, a staged near-death. There was no evidence, but rumors didn't survive because they were reasonable. They survived because Hollywood stayed silent. Burt Reynolds was the first to ever mention that silence. Hollywood's silence can be more frightening than any accusation. And he was right. No major star of that era spoke publicly to wish Clint recovery. No behind-the-scenes articles dug into the story. No talk show invited him to recount the event. Even though Clint Walker wasn't a minor actor, wasn't powerless, he had once been the pillar of American television. But Hollywood chose silence. Burt knew that, and for decades he avoided the topic completely. On KYW radio in 1973, when Jay Lawrence asked him about the accident, Burt simply replied, "In this business, some things are better left untouched." It was the first time Burt dodged a question about a fellow actor, and a sign that something had made even him, a man who feared no one, step carefully. For years, Burt said nothing more. Whenever reporters brought up Clint Walker's name, he changed the subject. To those who knew him, this wasn't indifference. It was hesitation strange, especially regarding someone he had met, known, and worked within the studio system. So what kept Burt Reynolds so silent? When he finally opened up in a private conversation recorded by author Michael Munn, Burt said only, "You don't understand." That accident, it wasn't like a normal accident. And the silence around it was even stranger. That sentence marked the moment Burt Reynolds finally broke the silence. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't spin any theories. He didn't reveal any explosive truth. What he did was reopen the door Hollywood had once sealed shut: a surreal accident, bewildered witnesses, sensational tabloids, and above all, a chilling silence. Burt said Clint had no enemies. But sometimes the ones without enemies are the ones people find hardest to deal with. A sentence loaded with meaning, not just about the accident, but about Clint's position within Hollywood, a man with no scandals, no drama, nothing anyone could control or hold over him. And in a world driven by leverage and contracts, someone too clean can become the most inconvenient. The accident didn't just nearly end Clint Walker's life, it exposed Hollywood's strangest reaction: silence. And when Burt finally spoke, he didn't retell the accident, he described Hollywood's unease toward it, a vague worry, an awkwardness, something unnamed. And he ended with the question he himself asked. A man with no scandals, no enemies, no ties to any faction. Why would he become the center of such a frightening silence? That question is the bridge that leads us to the next part where the real story begins to open. 2. Some people don't have to say a word, but their presence alone is enough to make Hollywood uneasy. That was the opening line Burt Reynolds used when he finally agreed to talk about Clint Walker. A simple sentence, but carrying a bitter truth about an industry fueled by attention and uproar. And Clint Walker, with his calm, clean image and almost unreal discipline, was the greatest contradiction of that era. People admired him, respected him, yet feared him in a way no one dared admit. Clint Walker was one of the very few male actors from the 1950s-70s who didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't party, and never became embroiled in romantic headlines or personal drama. In an age where paparazzi lurked outside every door, Clint lived a life separate, quiet, and free from temptation. He didn't need flashy appearances, didn't need controversy to stay relevant, didn't need backing from powerful groups. To audiences, those were admirable qualities. To Hollywood, they were a challenge. In 1962, famed columnist Sheila Graham Hollywood's Third Eye wrote a short but piercing line: "Clint Walker is a star with nothing to write about." And that is the problem. The article didn't criticize him, it revealed the frustration of the media. Stars with no scandals, no shocking quotes, no loud romances, no bad habits were stars. They couldn't exploit, couldn't inflate, couldn't turn into stories that sold papers. And Hollywood, an empire built on attention, disliked people they couldn't turn into content. Burt Reynolds once said in a candid interview, "In Hollywood, the cleaner you are, the more unpredictable you are, because you give them nothing to hold over you." That sentence described Clint Walker perfectly, and the studio system that struggled to handle him. An actor who didn't attend industry parties, didn't mingle with influential Warner Brothers groups, didn't show up to the booze-filled gatherings and forced networking was an actor without connections. And a star with no connections was a star no one could control. Clint Walker was exactly that. Despite being nationally famous for the Cheyenne series, he kept a working man's routine. Work, go home, read, train, talk, with family, sleep, early, rise early. Minimal noise. No showing off, no useless PR deals. People in the industry said that at Warner Brothers events, if Clint did appear, he would sit quietly, greet a few people, then quietly slip out. Not out of arrogance, but because he simply didn't belong there. This stood in total contrast to Hollywood's ideal star of the 60s, 70s, energetic, party-loving, press-friendly, always visible. Burt Reynolds was that model, charismatic, funny, bold, beloved by the media. He understood the rules. Clint didn't want to play, and Hollywood is always wary of those who don't play the game. On the talk show, Dinah. In 1975, Burt said a line that made the audience laugh, but insiders understood instantly. The quiet ones are the ones the system worries about the most. He didn't mention Clint Walker, but fans knew immediately who he meant. Among all the cowboy icons of that era, only one fit that description: giant and silent. That silence wasn't about mystery or strategy, it was character. Clint Walker lived like a true gentleman, punctual, respectful, calm, never stirring trouble, never prying into others' affairs. Colleagues said if you told Clint a secret, it would die with him. But Hollywood didn't know what to do with someone like that. They couldn't exploit him, couldn't create drama around him, couldn't sell stories about him, couldn't use his private life for attention. And because he was too clean, too independent, too untouchable when the 1971 accident happened, Hollywood stayed silent. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't want to highlight someone they could neither influence nor predict nor fully understand. Clint Walker was like a massive stone in Hollywood's river firm, steady, unmoved by the current. Those people either become legends or get quietly set aside by the system. Burt Reynolds understood this more than anyone. He once told journalist Michael Munn, Clint was the kind of man Hollywood didn't know how to handle. And when a system doesn't know what to do, it chooses to ignore. That is why Burt, despite being outspoken, rebellious, media-friendly, hesitated to mention Clint for decades. Because he knew that a single careless word would let the media twist it into something else. And Clint, a man too clean to protect himself against speculation, would never want that. And that is also why the silence around the 1971 accident became unsettling in its own way. Hollywood only stays silent about people they want, removed from conversation. Number 3. Clint Walker didn't fail in film. He was blocked. Some actors are disliked because of scandals, but Clint was frozen simply because he was too powerful for a studio to control. That was Burt Reynolds' remark when he was in his 70s, when the sharp edges of Hollywood no longer frightened him, and it was one of the rare times he broke the wall of silence surrounding the name Clint Walker for over 40 years. A light remark, but strong enough to expose the truth. Clint never had the chance to step into cinema because Hollywood never allowed him to. During the period from 1955 to 1963, Clint Walker was tied to Warner Brothers. Cheyenne Series 1 of the television series considered the backbone of the Western era. But few people knew that the series itself, that success itself, became the cage that locked Clint for years. Warner's contracts at the time were notoriously restrictive. TV actors were forced to film under extremely tight schedules, with fixed salaries far below their actual value, and with clauses that essentially forbade them from taking any film roles unless granted permission by the studio. With a physique as imposing, a cinematic presence as commanding, and a charisma as natural as Clint's, Warner understood one thing clearly. Once he stepped onto the big screen, they would no longer be able to control him. Clint Walker was the kind of actor studios were cautious of. He did not cause trouble, did not make unreasonable demands, and did not create scandals, which should have worked in his favor. But in classic Hollywood, where everything was built on dependency and power, actors who were too independent, too straightforward, and too strong were considered threats. Clint didn't need to flatter anyone. He didn't need to drink to get close to producers. He didn't attend parties where secret contracts were signed behind closed doors. And most importantly, he did not rely on Hollywood to determine his worth. That alone made him the hardest kind of actor for a studio to control. In 1958, when Clint requested that Warner reconsider his contract so he could take on film roles, the studio not only refused, but also tried to put him in his place. They attempted to introduce a new character into Cheyenne to show Clint he was not irreplaceable. Variety later described this tactic as studio retaliation, a systematic method of punishing actors who dared to demand their rights. Clint wasn't one to seek conflict, but he understood that if he continued accepting unfair terms, his career would remain confined to a box the studio had already built for him. However, in an era where the studio system reigned supreme, even a famous actor had almost no power to save himself. Burt Reynolds, then a young actor working at Warner 1959-1962, once said he had seen firsthand how the studio squeezed those they feared losing control of. Burt understood the feeling of being held back, being assigned to roles he didn't want, being handed contracts whose every line served to protect studio power rather than the actor himself. But compared to Clint Walker, Burt's situation was still mild. Clint was the one the studio froze most aggressively. To Warner, he was too valuable to let go, but too dangerous if allowed freedom. Years later, when Burt had become Hollywood's biggest star AP reporter, Bob Thomas asked him about the harshness of the studio system. Burt replied, "Studios don't fear weak actors. They fear strong ones." Those who had followed Clint's story instantly knew who Burt meant. Not John Wayne, not Kirk Douglas, but Clint Walker, a man too solid, too upright, and too difficult for Warner to control. The most striking part was that after Clint's 1971 accident, when a metal rod pierced his chest, missing his heart by millimeters, Warner maintained absolute silence. A studio that had earned millions from his image, a studio that had turned him into a national icon, offered no statement. No press release, no public well wishes, no visible support for a man who had nearly died. Burt Reynolds once described such silence with a chilling line. "Sometimes silence is louder than a gunshot." He didn't specify names, but those who understood the industry knew he was referring to Warner's unsettling reaction when the man who carried their entire Western division nearly died in a bizarre accident. Clint Walker should have had a magnificent film career. He had the kind of looks that later generations admired. He had a deep, resonant voice straight out of a Western novel. He had a masculine presence so classic that even Burt Reynolds admitted Clint is the kind of man who looks like a statue carved by America itself. And above all, he had the discipline and professionalism of a true actor. But the Hollywood of that era didn't want strength of that sort. They wanted people they could direct, shape, and control. Clint Walker was never that person, and so the door to cinema, a door that should have opened wide for him, was locked from the inside. For many years, Burt Reynolds didn't speak of this story. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew too well. He had been a victim of that system himself. He had been blocked, redirected, and misused. He had watched friends pushed aside because they didn't fit the mold. But Clint Walker was the most extraordinary case a man held back, not because of wrongdoing, but because his character was too powerful for Hollywood to accept. And when Burt finally spoke, he didn't just break his own silence. He cracked the silence Hollywood had sealed around one of the most honorable men of the cowboy era. 24. There is nothing more frightening than the silence of someone who knows too much. And that's why Burt Reynolds avoided mentioning Clint Walker for 40 years. Burt Reynolds was famous for speaking his mind. He was so blunt that some directors avoided him, so outspoken that some producers swore not to work with him again, and so honest that audiences loved him for it. He criticized the studio system on live television, retold backstage conflicts, and even took jabs at Warner Bros. So sharp that viewers at home felt he might have gone too far. But there was one name he avoided for 40 years: Clint Walker. Johnny Carson asked him about the original Warner Cowboys. Burt mentioned everyone except Clint. Merv Griffin asked about the foundational men of TV westerns. Burt listed names except Clint. Dinah Shore asked him about his early Warner days. Burt reminisced in detail, but skipped Clint. And across countless talk shows from Sally Jesse Raphael to David Letterman, the name Clint Walker never crossed his lips. Not once. A man who talked so much, who loved telling stories, who never feared upsetting Hollywood, remained silent about one single person. When someone talks constantly, what they refuse to mention becomes the most revealing of all. Burt didn't avoid Clint out of dislike. He avoided him because of boundaries. In old Hollywood, an unwritten rule existed. Some stories must not be told. Some people must not be named. Not superstition power. Anyone who crossed that line risked being handled by the system. And Burt, even bold as he was, understood clearly, Clint Walker's life held chapters Hollywood never wanted revisited. The 1958 contract dispute when Clint challenged Warner. The 1971 accident too strange to call normal. The years he was locked in television not for lack of talent, but because he was too independent. A man who lived through such things was a man Hollywood preferred the world to forget. Because remembering him would force the question, why was he treated that way despite doing nothing wrong? Burt knew the answer, and he knew Hollywood would never want to hear it. In 1994, during a private conversation with journalist Michael Munn, who had interviewed Burt dozens of times, Munn asked a question no one had dared to ask directly. "Do you ever think about Clint Walker? I've never heard you mention him." Burt fell silent for a long time, so long that Munn later described it as the longest silence of the interview. Then Burt spoke slowly, his voice dropping as if releasing a long-kept confession. He was someone Hollywood didn't know how to handle. Sometimes that's enough to understand. It was the first time in decades Burt spoke of Clint Walker without avoidance. And that sentence opened a door Hollywood had locked for half a century. When Burt said didn't know how to handle, he wasn't talking about behavior, he was talking about a system. A system that disliked moral strength, disliked independence, disliked actors without weaknesses or leverage. Clint Walker was precisely that. And so, Hollywood chose silence. Burt had lived something similar, though far less severe. He had been reassigned, manipulated, and sidelined. But Clint, the calmest, cleanest, most disciplined, was the most restrained of them all. A paradox that made Burt uneasy, because if he told the whole truth, he would be accusing the very system that made him who he was. Thus, Burt's silence wasn't neglect. It was respect. He knew Clint hated noise, hated being pitied, hated drama. Clint lived quietly, and Burt thought the best way to honor him was to keep his story quiet. Until his later years, when the old studio heads had lost power, when fear faded into clarity, and Burt finally dared speak what he had held for 40 years. Clint Walker was a victim of a Hollywood era that had no room for men who were too decent. When Burt said that he didn't speak only of Clint, he spoke for an entire generation crushed by the studio system. A generation bound by contracts, overshadowed by powerful forces, talents frozen simply because they wouldn't bow. Burt said it like an apology for Hollywood, for those who didn't defend Clint, and for himself. And when we connect it all, silence after the 1971 accident, silence around his stalled film career, silence around the 1958 contract pressure, silence around a man standing alone in Hollywood. We understand why Burt's silence was chilling. It wasn't avoidance, it was truth held back, because it could break a wall Hollywood had built to hide its own mistakes. When Burt broke that silence, he returned to Clint something Hollywood took from him: fairness in memory. Some stories don't need many words, only a sincere moment to show that silence can weigh more than a million sentences. Clint Walker lived quietly, without ambition for fame, without conflict. He came to Hollywood like a craftsman, worked with integrity, and left peacefully. But Hollywood at that time had no place for men who were too decent. It needed drama, weakness, leverage. Clint gave them nothing. That's why the 1971 accident was buried in silence. That's why the film door was locked. That's why an entire system avoided his name for decades. And that's why Burt Reynolds, who feared nothing, kept silent about Clint so long. But time erodes fear. As Burt grew older, and the old studio titans disappeared as Hollywood changed, he finally spoke the sentence that restored justice to Clint Walker. He was someone Hollywood didn't know how to treat. And sometimes that's enough to understand. At that moment, 40 years of silence disappeared like dust. No conspiracies proven, no enemies named. But truth doesn't always lie in details. Sometimes it lies in how those who witnessed everything choose to speak. Burt finally broke the silence, not to accuse, not to dramatize, but to say Clint Walker deserved to be remembered not as a victim, but as a man who stayed true to himself in a world intent on bending him. A solitary man in Hollywood, a forgotten legend, and a silence finally broken. If you believe this story deserves to be heard, leave a like so the video reaches more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss other secrets Hollywood tried to hide. And if you want me to uncover more hidden corners of old legends, comment on the name you want the truth about. Together we'll open the silent doors that Hollywood never wanted to open.